Now let's talk a little bit about race relations and the concept of cultural pluralism in the United States during World War II. All right, so again, the United States has to convince the public that it's important to get involved in World War II after all those years of isolationism. So FDR, President Roosevelt, claims that what we're fighting for are the four freedoms, right? And that's extremely important. We got to save these freedoms, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of fear, and freedom of want, right? Freedom of want is like ensuring economic freedom in a sense, right? That all Americans are going to make sure that they have that living wage so that they can participate in the consumer economy. So this is all an effort to try to convince the public that it's a good thing to get involved in World War II. All right. Part of the campaign to shift public opinion was to demonize the ideals of Nazi Germany, right? Because Nazi Germany was promoting racism, the idea that Germans were the superior race and all these other races were beneath them, and you know, all this anti-Semitism. So even though racism ran extremely high in the United States, right, in a number of different levels in society, the government needed to make it seem like the U.S. Supported racial equality. Okay, so this idea contributed to the sense of cultural pluralism, which we've talked about before, right? This idea that cultural pluralism is a key aspect of American culture, right? Americans of various ethnic backgrounds are going to be working side by side during the war, in the war industries, right? So you have a number of different people from a number of different ethnic groups working together, getting to know each other. You have Hollywood portraying multi-ethnic military units, right, in war movies. And all of this is just helping to promote this idea of a multi-ethnic identity in America, that Americans are not just one ethnicity, but there's multiple different ethnicities in the United States, and that's what makes America great, right? So that's what you're getting here, this idea of cultural pluralism, and now the government is behind the cultural pluralism because we're fighting against racist Nazi Germany, right? They're the enemy, we're the good guys, that type of ideology. Well, let's take a look at racial relations in the United States during World War II. Was the United States really promoting racial equality? Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Right? Okay, so concerning Mexican migrants, you have a large number of Mexican migrants coming into the country to work in the agricultural industry. Well, you have something called the Bracero program during World War II. And this program was created out of a deal between the United States and the Mexican government to supply laborers to support the agricultural industry, right? Because we need workers, because a lot of Americans are going overseas to fight in the war. So you have thousands of Mexican workers entering the country as part of the Bracero program. But is there really racial equality in this? You know, is it really a good thing for the Mexican workers? Well, you have a number of Mexican workers suffering bad working conditions, right? Very low wages, because they have no ability to form unions, right? They can't fight for their rights. They have to just pretty much take whatever their employers give them. Right? If they did try to form a union, they'd be threatened with deportation by their boss, right? And so that's going to keep them in fear, and they're not going to organize to fight for better rights, right? So in a sense, the braceros are being exploited by their employers, right? They're being exploited by their employers. So racial equality during the war? Okay. All right. What about the example of Asian Americans during the war? Well, the experience of Asian Americans varied. You have a number of Filipino Americans in significant numbers fighting in World War II. And then you have the US opening up immigration from China during the war as well, because China is an ally, right? So remember we talked about the Exclusion Act, where there could be no immigration coming from China. Well, China's an ally during this time, during the war, right? China's fighting against Japan. And so the U.S. is, as a good gesture, is going to allow some Chinese immigrants to come into the country. You know, so there's a quota. What's the quota? 105 Chinese immigrants could come to the U.S. every year. Just 105, right? Remember we talked about previous years where like millions of people were coming to the United States, or hundreds of thousands. Well, 105 Chinese immigrants could come to the U.S. during the war. Right? It's a gesture of good faith, right? So racial equality, what do you think? Okay. Then we have the example of Japanese Americans or Japanese migrants who are living in the US. Okay, so during the war, you're going to have over 110,000 Japanese residents on the West Coast in the United States, right? The majority of them are US citizens who've never even been to Japan. They're going to be forced into internment camps, right? And this is because there's fears that these Japanese residents may aid the Japanese military in an invasion of the West Coast, right? And so they're going to be relocated to camps far from the West Coast, right, to stop this supposed invasion. And they're kept in horrible living conditions. They're living under the watch of armed military guards, right? So it's almost like they're in some kind of jail or something, but it's an internment camp. And they were being forced to take oaths of loyalty, right? Like saying that they're loyal to the United States. And they're also being forced to join the military, right? They got to sign up for the draft. If not, they go to jail, right? Got to fight in the war. So, so this is the case for Japanese Americans and Japanese residents in the U.S. at that time, right? Horrible conditions, very oppressive. And so eventually, years later, the U.S. is going to apologize for Japanese internment, and they end up giving $20,000 to each person who experienced internment. And this takes place in 1988. But yeah, this is, is this racial equality? U.S. versus, evil racist Nazi Germany, but you have still examples of racism in the United States. Okay. All right. And finally, still talking about racial relations, let's talk a little bit about Native Americans. Native Americans also are going to play an important role in World War II. You have members of multiple different tribes actually fighting in the war. In particular, Navajo soldiers were crucial to the war in the Pacific against Japan, right? Why? Well, the Navajo language was used to create a code that was unbreakable, right? Japan could not break their code. Remember earlier we talked about how the US was successful in breaking Japan's code, and that's what led to military victories, the Battle of Midway. Well, the US had a code that was unbreakable, and that code was based on the Navajo language. Okay, so this is important because it allows military units to communicate with each other without the enemy being able to catch on to what their plans are, right? And this code is not just Navajo people speaking to each other in Navajo. No, it's a whole really complicated code. Okay, so you have like specific Navajo words which would translate into something different in English, right? So they may be saying something like the word sheep in Navajo. But that's not, they're not actually saying sheep. That word is a code word in English for something completely different. Okay, so it's a complicated code. And so you have Navajo soldiers speaking their language, and they're actually present there in the Pacific fighting the war, right? Such as at the Battle of Iwo Jima, that famous image from World War II where the soldiers are holding up the flag. That's on Iwo Jima. It's an island in the Pacific. And Navajo code talkers were there fighting in that battle and using the code to help the military. Okay, so very important. So you have Native Americans playing an important role in World War II as well. Still talking about race relations, let's go ahead and talk about African American rights during World War II. Okay, so during World War II, you have the second Great Migration taking place, where 700,000 African Americans will migrate from the South to the North in pursuit of better opportunities, looking for opportunities for work, and to escape racism and segregation in the South. Unfortunately, African Americans still experience a lot of violence in the North, right? So we have, for example, race riots taking place. And in the South, lynching is still going on. So you have a lot of racial inequality in the United States, not just in the South, but also in the North. What about the war effort? Well, you have a number of African Americans taking part in the war. Over 1 million African Americans joined the military during the war, but were forced to fight in segregated units and were mostly made to do manual labor rather than experiencing combat. But you do have a number of African American soldiers who did experience combat, such as the Tuskegee Airmen, which was a flying squad composed of mostly African American pilots. All right. But while this war is going on, you still have African American civil rights organizations that are fighting for racial equality at home. right? Because the US is saying that they're fighting against racism, right? They're fighting against Nazi Germany. And so that means that the government's for racial equality. Well, this is the perfect time for civil rights organizations to step up and start asking for rights, that the government is going to pass laws that protect their civil rights. Okay, so an example of this, you have a civil rights leader by the name of A. Philip Randolph, and Randolph is calling for a march on Washington, D.C. Okay, why? Because there's job discrimination going on, right? Remember I talked about how the Great Depression ended because there's all these war industries now, different factories that are producing various materials for the war. Well, yeah, there's millions of jobs available in those war industries, but there's so much discrimination going on that African Americans are not able to get a lot of these jobs. Okay, so Randolph is threatening a march on Washington, D.C., which would look really bad to the international community when America is saying, hey, we're, the good guys in this war, we're fighting against racism, Nazi Germany. Okay, Randolph also wanted to pressure the government to end segregation in the South and to create an anti-lynching law, because you still have lynching going on quite a bit, mostly in the South. So yes, the march would have looked pretty bad for the US. So in response, you have President Roosevelt, FDR, decreeing Executive Order 8802. And so Executive Order 8802 creates the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And the point of this commission is to investigate allegations of job discrimination only in the war industries though, okay? But that's a step forward, right? So now you have a federal agency that's going to hear grievances and complaints about discrimination in the war industries, and it's possible that this is going to open up more jobs for African Americans. And so this is seen as a victory, and the March on Washington is called off, right? So Randolph doesn't move forward with the march, okay? So yes, you have the fight for civil rights going on during the war in the 1940s, okay? And you also see some desegregation taking place in the military. So towards the end of the war, the Navy drops its segregation policy. And even the Army starts to take some small steps towards desegregation as well. And at home, the government is going to pass a law that outlaws poll taxes for African American soldiers and veterans, okay, which is going to increase the African American vote in the South. If remember, a lot of African Americans could not vote in the South, sometimes due to literacy tests or the poll taxes. These are all measures to try to discourage voting. Okay, redistricting, we talked about these things before. So now the government's stepping in to at least eliminate poll taxes for African American soldiers and veterans who are, giving their lives, risking their lives in the war.